That's fine.
Go for it.
Yeah, and I don't know, Aparna, if you were talking about me when I logged in, but yes, my internet is sketchy sometimes. I'm linked to my phone, which should work. It worked when I called into the National CASC network call this morning. Okay, so yeah, so Heather and I Heather was interested in getting an update on this project I've been doing with Wyoming Game and Fish Department and the workshop we just had, and we figured that there may be others that were interested in listening in as well. So I've got a bunch of slides to share, but don't whatever, it just isn't this is informal, so jump in and interrupt me however you want. And I ultimately think this project could be of interest to you guys and others, both in terms of the sort of content of what we covered with Wyoming Game and Fish Department around the implications of climate change for their statewide habitat planning, as well as sort of on the method side. And on the method side can probably be parsed out between sort of the process of co-production, but also just like nuts and bolts logistics of how we do some of this kind of work virtually when we used to do it always in person. So right now I can speak most to the sort of method side. I mean, I'll talk about the context in which we're doing this work and what Wyoming wants to get out of it and things like that. But as I'll talk about in a few minutes, one of the challenges with the way we did the workshop was we got tons of information from the workshop participants. And I mentioned this maybe on the last CP call. And it's actually been like a lot of work to sort of digest it and make some sense of it. So I'm actually not as prepared to talk about kind of the content of what we think we really accomplished as it relates to the statewide habitat planning. So I'll talk more kind of on the method side, and I could talk later about the content once we have a better handle on that.
Molly, can I ask a request? Can I have a request to talk about the context, like how this got started, who you reached out to, how that relationship developed, kind of like the origins?
Yeah, definitely. Is there anything else that like folks know? I mean, I have some of that. Well, anyways, I could add some context around some of the slides I have on that question in particular. Are there other things that people are kind of like especially interested in hearing about? Okay. Well, oh yeah.
Knowing a little bit more about the project, I'd be interested to hear your take on why the conversations with Wyoming went really well, but then engaging Montana and Colorado was harder and it didn't actually pan out. So maybe something about how do you know when a partner is actually going to go somewhere with you?
Oh yeah, great. Yeah, so that relates to your questions too. Yeah, I can speak to that.
I was going to say related to that too is kind of working across. I mean, it sounds like Game and Fish is the main department you're focused on, but even working across different individuals within that department and the relationship dynamics and just trying to get more people involved and then trying to get leadership support, kind of all of those things I'm super interested in because they're so contextual and I think best practices are really helpful.
Yes, I'll try to touch on some of that. I'll definitely try to touch on some of that in my comments proactively, and then obviously feel free to ask more questions as we go. So yeah, so this is a project that was funded with a couple different years of funding from Robin and Aparna. And it's sort of originated from just sort of the general premise of the North Central CASC wanting to be as intentional as possible in their investments in new research to kind of link that research to management decision-making. And so the project actually had a couple of goals to it that are on here, or objectives. It was around generally just providing support to state agencies and others that were making decisions around, priority species and habitats and incorporating climate change thinking into those decisions. But then it also has this sort of interest in sort of thinking about the methods and approaches we use to co-production. And it started the first phase, which was really led by Shelley Crosby. She conducted a series of semi-structured interviews with fish and wildlife managers across the North Central region She's presented some of this to our, during our CP meeting, I think last summer. And, the goal there was to identify like what's a sort of timely upcoming decision or planning process you're involved in for which you think climate information could be useful. And, long story short, we can send you the report, but we got like a very long tail of priorities. There was not high overlap on a small number of shared priorities. There were lots and lots and lots of topics, and they ranged from species to broader habitat issues to issues like around connectivity or wildlife disease. So, that process we had hoped would kind of help us maybe filter like what are some shared topics of interest. And it did a little bit of that. But as you've seen sort of how it's been incorporated into the science agenda for the North Central and thinking about funding priorities, it's still a pretty broad set of priorities coming out of that work. But that work sort of started to feed directly into the North Central's work right away. But then also we had received funding for phase 2, where we wanted to pick one of those topics, of high interest across the region, for which there were some specific upcoming decision opportunities to go deeper and start to sort of bring scientists and managers together to look at what kind of climate information would be really useful in making that decision. So the phase 2 is really focused on picking one of those topics of shared interest, highlighting a specific decision opportunity or opportunities, and then again, bringing together sort of this, starting to create this kind of co-production team of managers and climate experts. We sort of did this, one of the big activities that I'll be focused on talking about today was a climate change planning workshop. And I'll talk a little bit more about the role of that workshop in the broader process. But coming out of this project, this phase 2, we hope to be able to actually help support an agency in including climate information in a plan, while also identifying some high priority management relevant knowledge gaps that could be, again, feedback into the evolving North Central science agenda. And again, we want to sort of learn as we go so that we can also share some hopefully useful information about methods in co-production. So the shared topic of interest that we chose to focus on was around river and riparian ecosystems. And so so that came out of the interviews. It was a topic of high interest. But there were other topics we could have picked. And so really the main filter we used to sort of go from like the long list of priorities that Shelley got out of the interviews to a particular topic to focus on was based on manager interest. And so as we shared the results of the interviews back with the state fish and wildlife agencies through some presentations and written reports, we also put out a call for like who's interested in going a step further for your particular system or species or high priority decision need. And in fact, not very many hands were raised when we sort of asked for a show of hands. And in fact, the main groups that were interested were Wyoming Fish and Game and Colorado Parks and Wildlife. And in particular, it was fisheries habitat, and then fisheries, sort of species or aquatic species managers in those two states. And so after, I had some initial conversations with both the manager in Wyoming who was interested and the managers in Colorado. And what it came down to for this project was Wyoming had a very specific decision opportunity. So they are revising their statewide habitat plan in 2020. So the timing was right to contribute to that plan and that decision. They were asking for support in thinking about climate change within that plan revision and interested in it. With Colorado, and they really just, I had actually been involved in a workshop with Wyoming Game and Fish Department in around 2010. About 10 years ago. And that was really the last time the agency really formally and more as an agency sort of addressed the issue of climate change. So they really, didn't really know where to start and needed some support. Colorado was also very, they're very interested and very committed to thinking about climate change in their work. They were sort of like, we don't need help in thinking about how climate change might inform our decisions. We actually kind of know that the big issue is around water availability and managing water use, and that's a political thing. Like, it's not like we don't need new science to tell us that. We don't need planning to tell us that. We need to figure out how we're going to deal with human water use, and that's a political challenge. But they were like, we are engaging in water management plans for various basins across Colorado, and it would be really helpful if we had better information on future stream flows to help guide where we might focus our attention on engaging in basin level water planning. So in that case, again, they didn't really need some of the exploratory, like, how will climate change affect this decision thinking. They kind of were already pretty far along in that. They actually had a very specific information need around, they want future stream flow projections, across, that are kind of cover the whole state and that include future water use. And, from a human use perspective. And they had like a general sense of how they might use that information, but not like a specific decision or plan that they were developing. So given all that, I chose to work with Wyoming because the sort of real specific decision opportunity was there. I felt like the Colorado folks were certainly interested in and engaged. And were willing to talk with me several times about the project, explore it. And I think they would actually, they would probably actually be really interested in a conversation about, like, how can we get the kind of stream flow modeling that they want. And I think that's something we could talk about, like, as a consortium or as a cast, maybe we could work together on it. But again, they were still kind of like, yeah, we have some sense of when we could use it, but weren't real specific. But Aparna, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm just curious if they articulated why they wanted it, if they didn't have a specific purpose for it.
I guess it was more like, it wasn't like a specific plan or specific decision they would use it in. I think they could see using it probably in a variety of ways. Like, so, definitely thinking about where are some of their highest priority basins or sub-basins across the state from a fisheries perspective, to then concentrate their efforts on trying to secure in-stream water. And again, not just like through purchasing in-stream water rights, et cetera, but engaging in water management and planning in those areas. So they were able to articulate some ways they would use the information. And I think it can, it probably would have folded into a variety of other kinds of planning processes. It was just like, again, in terms of having a sense that there was like a potential vehicle or outlet for the results of this project. It was less specific.
Right, so maybe they're thinking of it as like an additional data input or data layer to analysis that they're already doing for thinking about species and habitat. Okay, that's helpful, thank you. Yes, and they were also pretty far along. They've done a lot of work on cold water trout, and they were especially interested in those kind of more transition mountain prairie, like the sort of prairie transition streams where there is less information. So, I mean, I think that, yes, like an alternate, like if I could have done two projects, the project with Colorado would have probably been, in a sense, less exploratory about kind of how climate change might influence their management, and more specific about, like, how would you use stream flow data? Like, how would you, this stream data you're describing, how would you actually use it? And pushing them and, kind of getting them to really be specific as possible on that, to then probably have a conversation again with stream flow modelers about, like, what's possible. They're also aware that there's like a patchwork of, like, some of the work's been done in this basin and some in this basin, and USGS is working on this and somebody else is working on that. And though, so for them, like, having a convener to try to get folks on the same page and hopefully orient towards their agency's needs, they saw as a real value. It was just, like I said, I was especially excited about this opportunity to work on, like, a specific plan. Yeah, I mean, what was exciting for me about this project, so I've done like a lot of workshops like the one I'll describe, a lot of that work.
never have I done any of this work in the context of like a very specific plan that an agency is developing or revising. And, you know, usually in the past, it's been me inviting agency folks to like, come on, don't you care about climate change? Come participate in this workshop, you'll get something out of it. In this case, like, again, they were really like, we want to include climate change in this plan and we don't know where to start. And so there was very much an asking for support component to this relationship and the exchange I had with them that, you know, was exciting for me. So having, like, so Aparna mentioned, you know, so the process there and sort of the methods was just sort of having conversations one-on-one with each of these potential partners. And I'll say actually a word about Montana too. Montana did not raise their hand when I asked for interested partners. But I've worked with Montana in the past, and I knew that NCIAS was doing some work with the agency, you know, not on aquatic systems, but on terrestrial wildlife. And so I proactively reached out to them and said, in part because also one of the goals at the beginning of this project was to try to tackle a topic that was going to be relevant across state boundaries. So I also compromised on that piece in that, you know, by working specifically with Wyoming Game and Fish Department directly. And in the end, in the workshop, one of the things that didn't happen that I had originally envisioned at the start of this project was, you know, well, even if we did a workshop based in Wyoming, that we would invite participants from Colorado and Montana. And that was just one of the balls that got dropped in sort of having to rethink this whole project in light of COVID-19. It's one of those things where it was sort of like, as we got pretty far along in the process, I remembered that as something I had wanted to do, and it was sort of like a little too late to do that. But I think, again, part of this is like, this workshop's not the only thing I'm doing and can do and will do as part of this project. And so some of those things that were goals or things I wanted to do at the beginning maybe haven't happened yet, doesn't mean that there isn't still opportunities to try to bring them in going forward in maybe a different way than I had originally envisioned. But what I've been trying to try to do with this project is acknowledge, like, yes, I'm directly sort of providing a service to Wyoming Game and Fish Department. But and actually this gets into, I mentioned that this project's been primarily funded but with director's funding, but actually I have proposed to use some of my CP funding to sort of leverage some of my consortium partner funding to try to do a little more to extract from this project sort of content-wise. What does this tell us, or how do we learn from this project? What can we learn from this project in terms of statewide planning for wildlife habitat? Which could feed into SWAPs, it could feed, you know, state wildlife action plans, it could feed into potentially other kinds of planning processes that other states are doing. So, you know, I still hope to be able to share some of what Wyoming's done and learned with neighboring states and with others like ourselves that are providing support to state agencies on the content. And then, you know, again, part of the generalizability of this project is around some of the methods, and I'll talk a little bit more about how we're evaluating the, you know, successes and failures of what we're doing in this project, and documenting what we're doing and evaluating the effectiveness or lack thereof to then provide recommendations going forward for people who want to do more of this kind of work.
I would say even tribal fish and game departments.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it could be relevant there. Yeah, because some of the questions and the way we approach this, you know, could be relevant at a state scale, but it could also potentially be relevant at smaller scales if you want to look at like relative climate vulnerability across the reservation, or across the reservation plus sort of the neighboring lands that sort of the reservation relies upon and is affected by, and so on. So the first thing we did was, once we kind of, Wyoming Game and Fish Department and I agreed to work together, was I went through, again, a fairly structured process to articulate sort of shared goals for this project. And that was one-on-one. There's a core team at Wyoming Game and Fish that I've been working with, 6 managers there, all of whom are sort of on the core team for revising this plan. And I did one-on-one interviews with each of them. And then we had sort of a group discussion about the results to sort of hone the goals for the project, which are many and ambitious. around increasing the agency's knowledge and access to information on climate change and its impacts, increased familiarity with climate-informed planning, being able to incorporate climate-informed actions into their statewide habitat plan, improving relationships and networking with relevant experts, which again I see as kind of a kernel for building on in terms of actually doing maybe new science that could meet their needs, since this project is not designed to do new science, but to articulate what the priority needs are. And then sort of more added by me, but in discussion and with agreement from Wyoming Game and Fish Department, is the piece about learning around methods for co-production. And then, so when it comes to sort of what I see, how I see this project addressing the co-production process, it's especially focused, or maybe even only or primarily focused on kind of the initial steps of a co-production process. So taking taking to heart the idea that the synthesis of climate information or the generation of new climate information should really start with the decisions being made. And so this project is looking at those steps of really kind of understanding the decisions being made and the decision context, what kind of information are they including, looking at how climate change could affect that decision, perhaps starting in a conceptual way to then sort of say what information is already available that could plug into that decision now, and then what are the gaps in knowledge that, for the agency to be able to, make more climate-informed decisions on into the future. What information would they really need to have that's going to directly relate to decisions they're making? And so again, I see this as being kind of some of those precursors to how do we then know what information is needed, which you would then ideally sort of obviously co-production is not just a one-size-fits-all. It's not necessarily appropriate in every situation, but the idea being that this is the information that then feeds into some sort of process for producing new knowledge and information to meet those gaps. But that these are some key beginning steps to kind of get you to that point. Some of the things that I think are novel about this project, at least in terms of the bulk of what we've seen in the literature already on co-production, is I feel like there's a lot of what we read is co-production around kind of like climate scientists wanting to do more relevant work. And so there's still kind of that starting a little bit from the climate science perspective of like the science research and questions and what do we already know and what do we not know. But this is really intended to be kind of very decision specific. And then this sort of piece about the sort of synthesis and how synthesis fits into this process, I'm still trying to figure out if we're not using the right keywords in our lit review, but this, I have not seen as much discussion in the literature on how really targeted synthesis of available information and how it can plug into current decisions is a useful step in co-production of new information. And it's very different from the kind of synthesis that's done as part of like the national climate assessment or a regional climate assessment, where again, it's kind of more, that's sort of more general from the like, what is the information out there and how is it relevant to decisions? But it's much more specific. This is the decision we're making. What information is out there that's useful for making that decision in a climate context? So, like I said, I'm still trying to see whether there's literature out there that we're not quite tapping into that does talk about that. But I'm thinking that might be a piece of what we try to articulate and share coming out of this work.
Hey, Molly, this is Laura.
Yeah.
Going back, kind of step back to the beginning. So they wanted to include climate change in their habitat plan. Did they have other motivations? If they included climate change, would there be other opportunities, say, for funding to implement some of their recommendations or anything like that? Or this is just something they wanted to do for good science and good management?
Yeah. I mean, it's a good question, and I don't know that I can answer that question for sure. Never in my discussions with them were like specific, we want to be able to access this kind of funding or that kind of funding, and we think it's necessary to, incorporate it into our plan in order to be able to do it. No, that's never come up in our discussions.
Okay.
and again, going back to just a little bit of the timeline and how it all came together, there was, again, one manager at Wyoming Game and Fish Department. He's the statewide aquatic habitat lead for the state. And, you know, again, just trying to think of whether I have anything more like evidence-based to articulate why I think he was interested in it, other than like he had participated in that workshop 10 years ago. Generally speaking, I find aquatics and fisheries managers to be pretty keenly aware of and concerned about climate change. So it didn't surprise me that an aquatics habitat manager would have been more proactive, and that the fisheries folks in Colorado were more proactive than maybe some of the terrestrial folks we spoke to in general. Yeah, I'm not aware of any specific sort of reasons other than feeling like climate change is important to aquatic systems and we want to consider it in this plan.
Do you think there's a sense
Yeah.
that it would make them more competitive for like the Fish and Wildlife state grants compared?
Yeah, I mean, we did have it as one of our goals for this workshop that had to be pushed aside due to time constraints to talk about funding. You know, okay, so here are some of the climate informed work we think we want to do. How do we go about funding it? So they're certainly interested in wanting to think that through. But part of it is this plan, what it does is it sets their priorities for habitat protection and restoration across the state. And it actually is a plan that they lean on when they make internal allocations of their funding. So this hashtag Habitat Technical Advisory Group is sort of consulting the plan as they make recommendations. Like I think they get like a pool of projects that are proposed to them internally, and they make decisions about where to allocate funding. So that has been specifically discussed, but you know, again, certainly hasn't been a major focus on it being a major motivation of theirs to figure out the external funding. In terms of whether I think it will or will not, I don't know enough about the, you know, those like specific, you know, Pittman-Roberts funding or, you know, other kinds of things. But I would imagine this could allow them to tap into some new funding sources.
It seems to me like it has been a driver with the state wildlife action plans. But I don't know about the habitat plans, because like you said, those tend to be more internal funding decisions as opposed to external funding, but they are coupled in terms of like how they get implemented. So it could be sense the direction that things are going in terms of the state wildlife grants, and then they want their habitat plan to kind of fit with that and be seamless in terms of interpretation. Sorry, this is a digression, but I was just curious.
Yeah. No, but I mean, like understanding the motivation is helpful. You know, trying to unpack the motivation is helpful because this group has been a dream to work with. They've been super engaged, and I mean, we had, as I'll tell you in a few minutes, like we had like 55 people, you know, 50 staff from Wyoming Game and Fish participating in this workshop and really participating in this workshop. So, you know, anyways, exactly what the motivations were for each of those people, I can't speak to, but the core team, you know, and that's something I mean, this is a good point. I need to make some notes. Like that could be something I actually probe them a little bit more on to kind of understand for the learning process. Maybe make a quick note.
Well, and I think, you know, that within our region, there are states where it's much more challenging to talk about climate change. And Molly knows, like North Dakota, nobody wanted to talk to us.
South Dakota.
South Dakota. Oh, where Laura is. Nobody wanted to talk to us. And I wonder if understanding the motivation in Wyoming could be a way to open the conversation in places where it is more challenging to say, well, even if, you know, this is not a high priority issue to you, it's a high priority issue for XYZ reasons, and it may make you more competitive for XYZ funds. So I don't,
Yeah, Aparna, I think that was exactly what I was thinking. You know, when I've been a part of other state hazard plans, the only time they include climate change is if they're required to, or if there's some incentive federally or something like that. So exactly. Yeah.
I have a feeling that this is one of those examples of just having a champion who kind of is pushing this. And then obviously he's not encountering resistance when he says to the rest of the sort of Habitat Technical Advisory Group working on this plan, like, hey, why don't we bring in some climate change thinking? There are folks that are kind of like, oh yeah, it's probably a good idea. They're at least not resistant. You know, whether they would have decided, you know, whether they would have proposed to do it if Paul hadn't, you know, I don't know. But I can definitely try to learn more, and talking with them about that, that would be helpful, especially if it's helpful for others.
Well, I think the personalities are a huge factor. And I know what Elisa and I are seeing in Montana, and I'm sure you've experienced it too, Molly, is that there's political change. So working or talking about climate change is much easier than it used to be. But then within Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, there's a definite tension between states' rights and federal presence. And so that is something that we're trying to figure out how to negotiate and show that we're here to support you. We're not here to come in and tell you exactly how to manage your resources.
What to do and stuff like that. Yeah. The other thing I do want to say, because maybe this was early, I think this was a comment that maybe Elisa made when she was introducing me to the National Cask presentation I gave earlier today, is that I didn't know any of these folks before this project. I did not know Paul Day, the aquatic habitat lead for the state. I'd never met him before. When he emailed me after I sort of, you know, Shelley gave a presentation on the interview results, and we ended with a like, we're going to follow up with an email asking for volunteers. He emailed me. I had never talked to him before. So again, I think that really speaks to either, you know, again, I can try to learn more about his own personal motivations, but really speaks to the fact that he was motivated, the agency was receptive. You know, they do make comments like, we still don't know exactly what's going to get into the final plan, and they acknowledge some political constraints, and that is sort of more of a political thing sometimes than purely like what the biologists want to see in there. But yeah, so I do want to make sure that's clear, because it surprised me. Like even in the first few conversations, and especially when it became clear early on, I was like, you guys want me to come down and meet you in person? You know, I'm happy to come down. And they were all kind of like, nah, you know, doesn't seem worth you coming all the way down here, you know. And then of course that is no longer an option after a bit, but that part blew my mind. You know, again, like WCS certainly works with Wyoming Game and Fish Department. To be honest, my organization does not have great relationships with everyone in Wyoming Game and Fish Department. Like other people in my organization have had major problems with Wyoming Game and Fish Department. So, I mean, again, I did work on this workshop that Paul Day attended 10 years ago, but I don't even think it took us a while to put that together. Like it clearly wasn't something he was aware of when we first talked. So that's interesting too. Okay, let me keep going here. So just to give you a little bit of a sense of like how we're tackling each of these parts of the co-production process, you know, clarifying the decisions and decision context. I think that this is one that could be done even more systematically and rigorously than we maybe have, but, you know, looking at previous versions of the plan, talking with Game and Fish about what's included, you know, how they include information. And then I facilitated, I had time, you know, short amount of time, but like I was able to fit in one conversation where the core team at Wyoming Game and Fish explained the plan and what kinds of decisions it covers and what it includes on a call with the external climate folks that were presenting or participating in the workshop. So I had hoped to do more there than we did, but that was sort of like better than nothing given the situation. The second piece about, you know, how climate change might affect the decisions they're making or the plan, that was primarily tackled through this workshop where we brought together, it was really just Wyoming Game and Fish staff and some external climate experts. I'll say more about participants in a minute. The synthesis part, you know, we did a little bit of it going into the workshop. So Imtiaz helped prepare some handouts summarizing the projections. We had a lineup of speakers present that included others from the Western Water Assessment and the University of Colorado, University of Wyoming, USGS. But there's going to be more of that that's still a little bit to be determined after the workshop. And then again, this sort of piece of identifying knowledge gaps, we started at the workshop and we'll continue with some post-workshop follow-up. And then I just want to kind of make sure it's clear that, again, a big part of what we're trying to do here is documenting what we're doing. So I'm going to eventually have a publication that describes in details, like the interviews that I had with Wyoming Game and Fish to sort of articulate the shared goals for the project together. You know, we have pretty rigorous like pre-workshop and post-workshop surveys to assess the effectiveness of the workshop, but then I'll be also, you know, sort of evaluating the effectiveness of other interactions that I have with the core team. And we, you know, are thinking of a 6-month follow-up with all the workshop participants and some things like that will go into kind of really trying to be more specific about what works and why, and what kind of recommendations we and the Wyoming Game and Fish folks would have for doing this kind of work even better in the future. And the products and outcomes will be a report on the consequences of climate change for the Wyoming Statewide Habitat Plan. Obviously, I can't control what they end up incorporating into the SHIP, the plan, but you know, we'll at least be providing them with a foundation that they can draw from. And then, you know, the sort of list of management relevant knowledge gaps and some, you know, presentations and we plan on publishing sort of the lessons we learn from the methods and process. So, okay, to talk a little bit about the workshop. So again, the goals of the workshop were similar to the goals of the project: share best available climate information, discuss the consequences for the plan, identify some specific actions that could be incorporated into the plan, and identify those information needs. We ended up going with a fairly sort of similar format to what we probably would have done if we were in person, partly because we had, even before COVID, like flagged the week and done a save the date, and people were sort of already holding that week. And so we thought about, well, what if we spread it out over 2 weeks and things like that? And people were like, you know, people have already blocked off this week. Let's take advantage of that and not change that plan. So we did basically 2.5 days, you know, about a little over 3 hours on the first day in the afternoon, and then like 2 hours in the morning, 2.5 hours in the afternoon for Wednesday and Thursday. And again, maybe I'll kind of go more into the content of what we discussed and how we structured that time later. I'll focus more on, again, the sort of method and the way we organized it.
Did you feel like distributing the time that way was pretty good? Would you recommend that?
So yes and no. I think that 2 hours in the morning, 2.5 hours, like participation was pretty high, especially in the breakouts, as I'll talk about. So I didn't see lots of really noticeable signs of fatigue. So I think 2 hours is pretty good. 2.5 hours was fine. We did like 10 to noon and 1 to 3:30. So it gave people some time to do other things, you know, put out other fires if they had to. My guess is that, like, you know, again, if your audience is a lot of like working parents, doing this much in a day, it may still be too much. I mean, I know for me, I had to be able to like carve out that much time with my husband watching the kids at home. I've heard from other folks who have kids that like doing like maximum 2 to 2.5 hours in a day can be easier to work around. So thinking about that will be important too. The participants varied slightly across days, and we knew that going in through the RSVPs that we asked for. And, you know, we again had anywhere from 40 to 50 staff from the agency on, especially the interactive portion of the workshop. The first day was mostly presentations, and then the second and third day which we actually broadcast like available to the whole department. And then we had a more restricted invite list of only like 70 people that were invited to participate in the interactive workshop, you know, of which 40 to 50 staff came. And then we had, you know, varied from day to day, anywhere from 5 to 12 people either giving presentations, external climate experts giving presentations or participating in the discussions. And as I'll talk about more in a minute, it was really just me sort of facilitating the meeting, moderating the discussions, dealing with the Zoom logistics, which is not ideal, but worked fine. We used Zoom for the plenary and breakout sessions, and we also used Google Drive. For every breakout session had a worksheet that helped to guide their discussion for that breakout and be a place for people to deposit notes and comments. And so that we combined those two, and I think it worked really well. So successful and challenging aspects of the workshop. You know, we asked a variety of questions. I just picked two to show here today about, like, did you gain new knowledge? Do you feel more comfortable integrating climate change in your work? These numbers are very reflective of other questions we asked about. Did you learn about any new, you know, adaptation strategies for your system? Do you feel more familiar with climate adaptation planning approaches? They were all like very positive, yes. One piece that did not, you know, go as well as we probably would have expected during an in-person workshop was, like, did you meet any new individuals, you know, for whom you might sort of interact with? So that kind of expanding their network. I think that for the core team, my guess is that the core team's numbers tended to be higher here. I don't have an ability to pull them out. I do, if we wanted to later, I could, but right now they're just mixed in with all the other participants. You know, 50 is not bad for a virtual setting, actually. I mean, I was pretty pleased to see 50% of the people say that they met somebody new. But that's definitely something that's probably not going to be as effective as an in-person meeting would, because you don't have some of those, you know, lunchtime conversations. There are a lot of people doing virtual meetings now, and the sort of tips and techniques that sort of talk about ways you can facilitate some more sort of like forced little coffee breaks. You know, you put people in groups of 2 or 3 and make them chat for a 10-minute coffee break. And we didn't have time for those things. And so that's another maybe consideration on the time end, is that we really didn't have time for those, and it would have been nice. Go ahead, Aparna.
Yeah, so this question asked that you would develop or share information with. Was there a question about, like, who you would go to for information? Because I feel like maybe that would have been a...
Yeah. That is a good question. No, we didn't ask it. I mean, there are, there's at least one other question we asked, and I have to go back and look at how we worded it. It was more breaking it down, like, by session. We asked, like, how useful was each session to your work? And then something, again, I have to look at the wording. It's like, how useful was each session to either building or strengthening relationships with climate experts? So it's not quite the question you're voicing either, but it might give us a little bit of a different kind of piece of information. And those numbers were, you know, and it was like, not at all useful, somewhat useful, very useful, or not applicable if you didn't attend that session. And those numbers, again, the sessions were very useful generally. Actually, I have a, this is for, like, how useful were the sessions to your work. And you can see, you know, more than 50% found each session to be very useful. And if you combine useful and very useful, the numbers are very high. I don't have this slide yet for the other question we asked about, you know, you're building or strengthening relationships with external climate scientists, but they were generally somewhat useful, very useful, or somewhat useful, you know, a little bit more skewed towards the less useful end, but not, you know, it wasn't like all the numbers were the not at all useful. So
yeah, that's great.
That's something.
Yeah.
Did you give this survey, like, immediately after your last session? Did you just send it out, and what was the time?
Good question. Good question. Yeah. So we did a pre-workshop survey. So these are, and I mean, we have actually, I think I can share with you guys. I don't know why I wouldn't really want to or be able to share with you the protocols we used for the surveys. There's a couple things. One is we asked them actually on a 0 to 10 scale, like, how do you rate your knowledge on climate change impacts as it relates to your work? And we asked them that before the workshop and after. And we asked them this yes/no question. You know, did you gain new knowledge? So have an ability to look at, like, if they were on the low end of the knowledge scale going into the workshop, did they tend to, you know, were they more likely to say yes, or were they more likely to increase numerically between 0 to 10 versus somebody who is already, you know, maybe already pretty knowledgeable about climate change? So we have some more nuanced information we can pull out of this. we gave them the pre-workshop survey pretty close to the workshop because the IRB process took a little while. And, you know, probably within less than a week before the workshop started, we did the pre-workshop survey. The workshop ended on Thursday afternoon, and I think we distributed the survey on either the following Monday. I think we did it Tuesday morning because I got IRB approved, because I waited to get IRB approval. I wanted to see if the workshop triggered any like changes that I wanted to make to the survey. So I waited to get IRB approval. So after the workshop ended, we very quickly went back over the workshop survey and finalized it and got a really quick turnaround on the IRB approval. And so I think we sent it out Tuesday morning after the Thursday that the workshop ended. And we sent out, like, we sent it on Tuesday, we sent a reminder on Friday, a reminder on Monday. We probably got about, I think we got 35 respondents on the post-workshop survey. We had like 51 on the pre-survey and 35 on the post.
That's amazing.
And this was just for the Wyoming Game and Fish staff, which again, we're anywhere between 40 to 50 participating. Yeah, no, I feel pretty pleased. I feel pretty pleased with that. And again, I mean, like, indicators of their engagement, like 51 people did the pre-workshop survey. Like, they've got nothing. They've got no reason to do that, right? Like, they don't have any reason to do the exit survey. But we thought about doing the exit survey, Stefan, like in the like give them 5 minutes to fill out the exit survey before we actually had our closing session. And we decided not to, partly just because people are tired, and we actually kind of wanted them to be a little more, not do it when they're feeling really tired and low energy, and, never give a survey before lunch. I don't know. That's probably was a good tip, but I was tempted to. Let me just quickly go through some of these other, the technology worked, which is a miracle. I went into the office because my internet's so bad here at home. The Zoom breakouts were awesome. I'm sure many of you are playing around with them. Like, they were actually really great, easy to set up, easy to manage. You can move people between them. Somebody arrives late, you can move them into it. Zoom is good for a reason, despite all of its many problems. We even found ways to allow people to self-select. So we had breakouts that were done by geography. There were four locations that were the sort of focus of each breakout. And then there was another time where we broke out based on, like, category of management actions, which I could explain more about another time. And we found a couple different ways to let people self-select. First we said, okay, who wants to be in the Bear River Basin? And people did their little raise hand icon. And, like, they had to wait while I, assigned each of those people to that breakout. So that was the most cumbersome way. And it feels really stressful as a facilitator, but it wasn't that bad. It probably took 5-10 minutes, no more than it takes to actually, because then you hit your button and everybody goes to their, there's no mingling in the halls and moving around and stuff like that. We also used a Google Doc where we had the 4 breakout topics and people just typed in their names. And then while somebody else was giving a presentation, I then assigned those. So that when I could assign them when somebody else was presenting, that was always the smoothest way to do it. And then the other way to do it would be to have more than just one person handling the Zoom logistics. And so, while I'm explaining what people are going to do in the breakouts, somebody else could have been assigning the breakout groups. Participants were very engaged. Oh, go ahead, Aparna.
I was just going to say, you as host kind of needed a producer to help, like, actually make the whole show run.
I've heard people use that exact phrase for sure. And, and part of the reason why I didn't was partly COVID related. Some other colleagues that were going to sort of participate or be support on this, had little kids at home and couldn't commit the time that they had hoped to. But it was fine. It all worked out really well. Participants were very engaged in the breakout sessions. Those breakout sessions were 10 to 16 people, and everybody participated. Everybody was writing things in the document and verbally making comments. I do think that, well, I'll talk about the worksheets more in a minute. There was almost no participation in the plenaries, which were, like, really, really, really painful. And so it made the report back sessions, you know, pretty stale, which I hate report back sessions with event. I hate them. And so they were like my worst nightmare, like come true. But a few people commented online, you know, I was sort of joking about it. And a few people like said, like, it's the virtual setting. It's not you. Don't take it personally. But, you know, I do think you can do some more of these, like turn to your neighbor, you know, by randomly assigning people into groups of 2 or 3. And I think that would have been really nice to do. And I wanted to, but we just didn't have time. So that's another like time factor. Like if you make your sessions shorter, you may not get to do some of these kind of more interactive things that I think are, you know, trying to replicate what you can do in an in-person.
Do you think it would have been valuable to have like each group share their Google Doc and the notes they took and then highlight the like key points that then you would share, and then maybe you would ask like a point of contact from each group to, like you would call on them to share back as opposed to like just opening it up? I feel like that's real hard with plenary, is that if you just leave it open to volunteering. Sure, but yeah, but the idea of volunteering, you know, letting people self-volunteer is hard, but selecting someone to be a representative for the group can be a little bit more reasonable.
I mean, the reporting back part was fine, you know, like each group had some highlights to offer, because at the end of each work, you know, breakout session, I told them like, okay, you've got 5 minutes, make sure you come up with like whatever it was, you know, 3 actions you want to share with others, or, you know, the 5 biggest impacts you're concerned about. So those were fine. There just was no like discussion and interaction around them. Yes, we made all the worksheets available to everybody. So they were all in this sort of Google folder that everybody had access to. So anybody at any time could say, oh, what did the Bear River group talk about, and pull up their worksheet and look at it. And we encouraged people to do that, to like see more of the details. But as I'll say in my next slide, the worksheets were amazing at getting tons of information, way more information than I've ever gotten out of an in-person workshop, which was awesome. And I'm sure that there were quiet people who contributed way more than they would have in an in-person workshop. I mean, I can't quantify that. Maybe that should have been one of my questions. But we received so much information. Like, you know, that idea of like, it would take a long time to read through a worksheet. So it's not just like a glance at it and see the highlights if you weren't in that session. So it was really hard for me also. Like, I loved playing that role of like synthesizer and sort of helping to pull out patterns and stuff. And I really struggled, probably partly because I was doing the logistics as well as the facilitating and moderating. But also because there was so much information. It was hard. It's hard to piece through, you know, hard to pick through it and digest it quickly. So we're going to be doing follow-ups. So we're going to be like, so rather than just getting like the 10 or 12 research, you know, research needs out of this workshop, we got like 30 or 40. So we're going to be doing things like follow up with participants to help us rank and prioritize, and that will help. And then again, also like if you can spread these sessions out over, you know, do 1 per day, then you can also take more time to digest and process it in between. So that's the pros and cons of like spreading it out. We debated the spreading out quite a bit, and I mentioned the main reason why we landed on doing it on the days we did, but also there were like, we were mixed, like on the 6th core team at Wyoming Game and Fish. A few of them were like, oh, I'd like to have time to digest and think about things. And other people who are like, I'm going to forget everything we talked about if we wait more than a few days. So I think you're going to have sort of 6 of one, half a dozen of the other for that. I think that was it. I mean, I think that like generally speaking, like the workshop was very successful. The Wyoming Game and Fish folks were very pleased with how it went, surprisingly pleased, especially with the virtual setting. I'm pretty sure we had higher participation because of it. They were very convinced they had higher participation because of it. And some people only came for 1 day, but they wouldn't have come at all if they'd had to travel. So, but, you know, they also had, as an agency, started using Zoom at the start of the pandemic. And so our workshop was at the end of April. So, you know, it wasn't their first time using Zoom. We did a poll right at the beginning, a live poll about like, how comfortable are you with Zoom and with Google Docs? And, you know, most people were like, at least a little bit comfortable. And, you know, and then of course, regardless, and, you know, there were still obviously some aspects that I felt the workshop was not good at accomplishing, but my hope is we can try to think about those pieces, because that's not the only activity for this particular project. So I'm going to be thinking more about how to try to squeeze in some of those other goals and objectives in other ways. Yeah.
How do you think, so obviously you had higher participation because it was virtual, but you had people dropping in and out throughout the workshop. And how do you think that impacted the discussion and the content? Since if you'd done it in person, you probably would have had people there throughout the entire thing.
Right, you would have had maybe a smaller group, but more consistent participation. You know, it's hard to, I can't say, partly because, so I didn't actually like participate in any of the breakout sessions. I popped in and out, I made sure things were going okay. I would like pop into the Google Docs, but I didn't sit through any one solid one. So I can't really speak to how much retreading of ground they had to do, or, and that's something actually I can also add, but I had one of my core team organizers from Wyoming Game and Fish, and at least one in each breakout, sometimes two. So that could be a good question to ask them, about like whether they saw any downsides or consequences to people coming in and out. They didn't mention it proactively as like, oh, that was really frustrating or anything like that, but I could ask them. Yeah. So.
How are they dealing with internet connectivity? Wyoming seems to me like a really tricky place in terms of internet. And did they all have hotspots? Were they required by their department to get them? Like what? How do people connect?
I don't know. I mean, again, I can't speak to all the different participants. You know, there were occasional. I mean, and I can also, again, well, so two things. One is I can also, this is another kind of thing I could ask the Wyoming folks, just in terms of like, you know, for others trying to do these kinds of workshops. Again, this group's great. I'm sure they would spend a few seconds or minutes, you know, giving me some feedback. But there were occasionally times where I could tell, you know, people would turn off their video because they were getting garbled. And usually if they turned off their video, usually it was enough to like participate. I'm sure in the breakouts, there might've been times when people blinked out. There definitely were some people who I had to like always put back in their breakout rooms because they would get kicked out for their internet. And they would come back into the main room and I'd have to put them in the breakout. So, but like, that was rare. Like there was like one or two people that it happened to a couple times, but it was not like a, you know, prevalent problem. There were a few folks I know more on the outside of Wyoming Game and Fish side that had difficult, a woman from TNC, Wyoming, who, you know, she had both like small kids at home, which limited her participation, and she had really tricky internet. So I know it affected some people, but I didn't hear about it a lot from the Wyoming Game and Fish staff, but maybe I wouldn't have heard, maybe their colleagues heard.
I think it's really an
yeah, that's
interesting
obviously
question.
a huge problem.
Yeah, sorry. I was going to say, I think it's really an interesting question to balance this issue of, you know, access to technology and comfort with the technology to, you know, this idea that maybe participation is actually higher because it is virtual. And like, if you have to travel, you can't, for a day, you wouldn't do it, but you can zoom in for a couple hours and that works. So I think that's an interesting thing to kind of, you know, think about and balance as we're moving forward, right? Like to be sensitive to like all of those, you know, particulars. But one thing I was going to ask you about the like scheduling and the like climate change presentations that it looked like you had kind of on the morning of that first day. Did you pre-record those and have those like asynchronously, like people could watch them for like a week beforehand and then attend like a discussion, or were those live in kind of one of your sessions?
They were live. We did record them and have plans to distribute them. We actually haven't done that yet. Reminds me. But so I mean, the thing about the Google Docs is that, you know, we left them and encouraged workshop participants. And I think that even this reminder may have gone to like everybody who was on the invite list. Like, reminder, here's the link to the Google Docs. Feel free to go in and add any comments that you've thought about since the workshop. We kept them open for maybe 1 or 2 more weeks. They're actually technically still open. I don't know if anyone's gone into them or if anybody did at all after the workshop. I can look and see. You could obviously make those documents available to people who couldn't participate at all, and they could still have an opportunity when they have connectivity or when they have time to go in. Obviously, that's different than having had the context of the presentations and the, you know, instructions on what to do in those breakouts, and the core workshop organizers who are participating to kind of help keep things on track. But you could definitely, I think, in situations where you want to ensure, I think we got the level of a fantastic level of participation based on what they wanted. Now, depending on who your target audience is and who you want to make sure are participating, and especially when you anticipate that they may have greater challenges in connecting in this way, you know, you could do things like record the climate science presentations. You could record and make available my presentation, sort of setting the context and explaining the exercises, and then people could go in and do those worksheets at their own, you know, add to those worksheets then at their own leisure with the videos of what was shared at the workshop. You could definitely do that.
Yeah, I want to be sensitive to people's time because I know that we're a little bit past the hour.
Sorry, I know.
I still have questions. So if Molly, if you can stay for a little bit.
I have more time.
Okay. But if anybody else needs to,
obviously,
peace out.
Need to go.
I'm gonna hop off, but Molly, I'm gonna thank you so much for doing this presentation. And then she presented earlier to the USGS network of casts. And so thank you for both of those presentations. It has been really fantastic, and I've learned a lot. So I look forward to seeing you later.
Well, and once I know more about what we actually gathered and accomplished in the products from this, we could talk more about the content side.
Okay. Take care.
Thanks a lot, Molly. I'm going to jump off too.
Okay, bye, Stefan.
Sounds good. Bye, guys.
You're amazing, Molly. I can't believe you did all that for all those people. You're a superwoman.
Yeah.
It luckily turned out well. Yeah, if you got other questions, Stefan, I'd be happy to talk more about specifics.
Sounds good. See you guys.
Bye, Stefan.
Bye.
And I'm going to stop the recording because I feel like these might be like more good ones, but thank you very much.